Hi, everybody, and good afternoon, and welcome to UK Mediation's free webinar today, your Friday afternoon webinar. You're very welcome to join us. We have an enormous amount of people on this afternoon. It's clearly a topic that has piqued people's interests, so I'm delighted to join you. I'm Mike Talbot. I'm the CEO of UK Mediation, for those that don't know me. And I'm a psychotherapist by background, so there's still time to run away if you need to. And I'm here today to talk about the psychology of conflict, and in particular, about the model that we've developed here at UK Mediation for working with all types of interpersonal conflict. Our assumption is that to understand conflict and to resolve it, you need to understand the people who are in conflict. So what we do is to get people talking, we look beyond the presenting issues and think about what's going on in terms of people's motivations, in terms of the psychology, in terms of what goes wrong in interactions that we need to fix as mediators, as sort of neutral, impartial third parties who intend to fix what may go wrong in interpersonal relationships. Okay, so we have a chat box. We have a chat box over there, and we're looking at, you're very welcome. This is live at the moment on Friday afternoon. You're very welcome to make comments, ask questions, and to contribute if you wish. And we were very pleased to try and address those as we go. Very quick word about me. Like I say, I'm a psychotherapist. I worked in private practice for 13 or 14 years before doing this. We started in May 1999, and those of you who follow us will know we've been celebrating our 25th year this year. So a number of events we've been running, a number of things we've been doing to celebrate us becoming 25. And if you check the website, you'll see a lot of stuff on there in relation to that. So that's me. So let's have a look at what I'm here to talk about today. So in this webinar, I'm going to talk about a relational model of conflict and conflict resolution. What we mean by that is looking at the interface between two people, the overlap, the psychological contact, if you wish, between two people, how it works, what can go wrong, and what we need to do in order to fix it. We call our model Retalk. It's the model that we've developed, and it was the subject of my own doctorate in order to, like I say, get underneath the surface. And we have 25 years of experience of training people and mediating disputes using this model. So I think it's pretty tried and tested, and I'm happy to then lead on to talk about how mediation works within the Retalk model. Looking at the numerous people we've got on today from the UK and around the world, actually. You're probably, some of you are trained and you're probably familiar with a model of mediation. Ours is paying particular attention, like I say, to what's happening at the psychological level. And I want to relate that to a mediation model. Talking about why the model helps, why would we do all this? What's the benefit of taking this kind of an angle on conflict and conflict resolution? And then there'll be a bit of time at the end for discussion or questions or comments. But like I say, if you do have something to say as we proceed, you're very welcome to chip in, make a comment, ask a question, and we'll do our best to resolve it. So what are we talking about? Well, with a relational model, it's partly borrowed from psychotherapy. You don't need to be too worried about this word Gestalt. It's a German word. It means a pattern or a whole, W-H-O-L-E. And it's to do with how we make sense of the world. Okay, so my particular model in working as a psychotherapist was Gestalt. There are lots of different models of psychotherapy. We don't need to get too bogged down in that one, but it's to do with how we make sense of things. And as applied here, it's to do with how we make sense of conflict. How we make sense of conflict is as a rupture in a relationship. So two people relating, it breaks down, often not that dramatically. It can be a slow and difficult and lengthy process. And there becomes a lack of psychological contact between the two people. So whereas they used to interact successfully, give and receive support and challenge, now that becomes ruptured. Now they have that loss of psychological contact. And we're thinking about how that can be resolved by the restoration of that contact. So if we think of conflict resolution as getting the two parties back into a quotes relationship, then we can see that as a way to resolve conflict. When I say relationship, it doesn't mean in any way intimate. We have working relationships, we have neighborly relationships, we have family relationships. It's just about how we interact and relate with other people. So looking at what happens when conflict develops and deepens, and how we can restore the psychological contact between two parties as a means to resolving their conflict. And within this kind of way of looking at things, within this way of trying to make sense of interaction and relationships, looking at this idea that conflict doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's a context around every dispute, around every conflict. So what I mean by that is that context is important. So I get on with my neighbour perfectly well. We're grand living next door to each other. If anything goes wrong about trees or parking or fences, we sort it straight away and we're fine. If I was in the same, I don't know, squash club or chess club as my neighbour, maybe we wouldn't get on so well. And maybe I couldn't work with him. Maybe the guy would be difficult to work with. So the context in which we interrelate with other people is important. So what's going on around the outside, including other people around the outside? Who else is there? So he's called Chris. Chris and I might get on working together in a particular industry or a particular office. If we went into a different industry or different office, maybe we wouldn't get on. So it's to do with who is around you and what context the conflict takes place in. That's what we mean by a relational model, all about rupture of relationship and how to fix it, all about restoring contact between parties and recognizing it doesn't happen in a vacuum. I've got a few of these diagrams just to try and illustrate it. So we've got a dark-haired person, a fair-haired person who are in a decent relationship. Okay, there might be neighbours, there might be work colleagues, there might be in a family, it might be anything around a complaint scenario, a medical mediation scenario, whatever's happening, the two characters here, they're getting on okay. So there is dialogue between them. They're able to speak. They can give and support challenge and accept challenge from one another. And what we mean by that with support and challenge is this is what characterizes relationships. So relationships tend to be characterized by people being supportive of each other and people challenging each other. It's a healthy relationship when you can see that there is a balance of those two things. It's a very sort of, what should I say, therapish way of looking at things, but giving and receiving support and challenge, this is what characterizes a healthy relationship usually. As you probably know with your own loved ones and family members. So they're able, dark hair and fair hair are able to interact with each other and with those around them. If it's a work situation, it's colleagues, it's HR, it's management, etc., maybe friends at work. So everything's fine, everything's tickety-boo. And we've got there with the blue arrow sort of pointing to sort of outside that sort of dotted line box between the two parties. What's going on there is that other people outside of these two's relationship are able to interact with them in a good way, also perhaps giving support and challenge, but things are working fine. Okay, so what can happen in the event of the two parties start to have this friction in the relationship? Starts to go wrong in terms of they fail to accept support and challenge from one another. They fail to see one another's perspectives. They fail to start to take one another's concerns on board. They might have a difference in working style. They might have a difference in verbal style. They might have different expectations about how the relationship should work. So things start to go wrong between them. And let's have a little look at how that can happen in terms of these diagrams. So a wall starts to appear between the two parties. It becomes ruptured by conflict. So whereas there was this nice, clear interaction between the two, what happens is we start to get this bit of a brick wall and the communication starts to get impeded between the two parties. What this means is that their needs and their goals or priorities, or sometimes their values, become incompatible. Now, we're using the workplace example, but this can happen in neighborhoods as well, of course. And people's lifestyles, their needs of what they require in order to have a nice, peaceful lifestyle, what they believe around particularly sensitive issues around childcare or lifestyle or even mundane things like timekeeping, these things become incompatible. So in particular in workplaces, people's values or communication styles, use of language, management styles, sometimes how they interact, how they share, these things become incompatible. And this is when we start to have conflict. So the relationship gets a bit ruptured by conflict. This brick wall starts to build between the two parties and the communication starts to break down. And then what happens, referring back to these other heads around the outside, is that they start to get involved. So the two parties, dark hair and fair hair, start to turn their attention and to people around the outside, other people in the office, management, HR, other friends, people on social media. They start to talk about their conflict to other individuals. And what happens is that those friends and colleagues start to take factions, they'll take sides and form factions. So you'll have the dark-haired person will have his or her crowd, fair-haired person will have his or her crowd. What happens is people get into groups, factions, teams, sides around the dispute and start to take sides. We have a natural tendency to do this, to form alliances, to form groups. And we also have a natural tendency to become quite judgmental when we feel that our champion is, is on the receiving end of some poor treatment from someone else. So this is what happens, and it starts to simmer. It starts to simmer. People take factions, two parties, communication breaks down a bit. This wall starts to build between the two of them. So I couldn't manage to get the first video working. I've got another one here. So we've got Sally and Heather in an office. Interaction's starting to go wrong. Heather's a bit irritated with how Sally seems to be on the phone all the time. Sally seems to be talking to friends. Sally seems to be spending quite a bit of time away from the desk, not on task. Heather is more of an on-task person, and we see this a lot in workplace disputes. She's more of an on-task person. She's more somebody who wants to get her head down, see a thing through to the deadline. And this is what can start to go wrong between the two of them. Okay. So we'll get this friction between the two, and often there's a spark to their conflict. There's often something that causes it to kick off, if you like, something that will start to make the temperature rise and for things to start to go wrong between the two of them. So if we can possibly do so, we'll take a look at that video and we'll get a look at what happens with Sally and Heather in the kitchen this time. When the friction starts to develop. Here's Sally and Heather.
Oh, has she had a second baby yet? Oh, that's lovely. She had a little boy. What's she called him? Oh, that's really nice. Hold on a minute.
Sorry to interrupt. How's your part of the report going?
Yeah, getting it done.
Do you think you'll have it done by tonight? Only I've got mine finished and I need to work yours into it.
By tomorrow. Yes, hi Ruth. Sorry for the interruption.
Sorry, Sally, I've not finished.
Sorry, Ruth, I'll have to ring you back.
You've been on the phone for nearly 20 minutes. You could be doing your report then.
I'm
before
on the
that, you
phone
had a break.
to Ruth from Albright.
Well, it doesn't sound like it. You was on for at least 20 minutes, and before that, having a break.
Is that right? That's the crux of it, isn't it? You are constantly monitoring when I go for my break. You think you're in charge, well, you're not. You're always evaluating what I'm doing and timing when I have my breaks. I've had enough of it.
No, I don't. You're just being bloody childish now. For God's sake, can you just get your part of the work done? I've had enough of this. You're an absolute nightmare. I'm going to have to speak to James.
Okay, right. Anything but that. Please don't speak to James. So the dispute develops. This is what happens is that there's friction between the two parties, difference in working style. Sally feels as if she's been scrutinised by Heather. Heather's impatient with her because she wants Sally to get on with the work, do your part of the report. We've got a deadline to meet. She's quite work-orientated, deadline-orientated. Whereas for Sally, it's important to be speaking to the supplier. She's speaking to Madeline from Albright's. She wants to build a relationship with the supplier outside of work. Okay, so very different styles. Sally may be more people-focused. Heather may be more task-focused. Very, very simplistic. But this is a bit of the clash between them. And there's maybe something to do with their working habits as well. There's a thing where Sally likes to eat at the desk and Heather doesn't like this. She prefers just to eat at meal times and not to have food at the desk and da-da-da-da-da. And then Heather walks in the kitchen. There's Sally on the phone again, not at the desk typing away. There's probably some history to this. There's some history in terms of And when we see the bigger picture of this, there's maybe some history about how Sally got the job, or the fact that she's been put in this office with Heather and it doesn't suit her. Lots and lots of contextual things. But as the dispute develops, the wall gets built higher. So the wall we saw with a few bricks in it has now got lots of bricks in it. And we see the two parties turn their heads away. They look away from each other, metaphorically speaking. And again, this is what typically happens in conflict, is that people who used to interact and be able to give and receive support and challenge, who have that psychological contact, now come out of contact. They turn their attention more to their factional supporters. So fair hair is turning to his or her crowd who are going, oh, you'll never guess what just happened in the kitchen. She just said this and just said that. And dark hair turns his or her attention to her factional supporters, his or her factional supporters who says, God, that woman, she doesn't meet a deadline. She never meets a deadline. She's a terrible worker and she's blah, 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 blah. And they love to tell one another about it. In practical terms, this is often where management and or HR might get involved. So what tends to happen here is they start to see very negatively the other party. They also start to make assumptions about the other person's motives and mindset. They start to second guess the other party. And this is a key thing in conflict. And I think it's a key indicator that we need to act. So there are ups and downs in people's relationships. It's fair to say it's perfectly normal. But when they get to the point where they're mind reading, making assumptions about the other person's motives and mindset, saying, oh, she thinks I'm this, she thinks I'm that, she thinks she runs this place, she thinks she can tell me how to, when I can have my breaks, she thinks she's better than me. And she's going, I reckon she's gunning for that promotion, I think, it's when we start to imagine what somebody else thinks. In therapy speak, we call that projections. So a projection is about looking at another person and instead of seeing them for real and seeing them for who they really are, what you imagine is what they're thinking. What you begin to imagine is, what their motive is, what their mindset is. The reason it's called projection, it's almost like this other person is a screen onto which you project your own thoughts and expectations. So you don't stop seeing the person clearly. And what you start to see is actually your own assumptions and expectations about that person. You project those assumptions and expectations. And it's a key thing, I think, in conflict, and we often see it early on when things really start to come off the rails. Okay. What then happens is you start to see the other person as all bad. And we start to seek confirmation of this. So we start to filter out anything that fails to confirm our view of that person. So various words for this: confirmation bias, cognitive dissonance. If I've fallen out with somebody, I don't see the good in them. All I do is see the bad in them. And they can even just pass me in the corridor and say good morning. And I might say, yeah, typical. Did you see how she said good morning to me then? Good morning. Sarcastic. So perfectly innocent thing to say good morning to a colleague. But when we get to this point in a conflict and there's all this projection operating, what I do is I start to see them as all bad. And I only filter in that which confirms my view of that other person. I filter out anything that might be dissonant or contradictory to my view of that party. And then what happens is that the dialogue gets very poor. We stop talking to that individual. We've turned our attention away. It can become quite competitive. Who's going to score points off each other? And it can become quite destructive. And the other thing that happens is that we see when people fall out at work, they'll pass each other in the corridor without speaking. They'll look the other way in meetings or Zoom meetings these days. They will fail to say that which they need to say to the other party. So what happens is that when we fall out with somebody in a workplace, we tend to be quite tight-lipped. See them come in. We're not saying the thing that actually we need to say. We hold it in. Instead of expressing what we need to express, we hang on to it and we don't say it. We might say it to our mates, we might say it to our supporters and our buddies and our crew, but we're not saying the important things that need to be said to the other party. The other jargon word here is retroflexion. So we hang on to it. That which should be expressed out that way, actually we swallow it down and keep it in. We retroflect it instead of expressing it. Okay. So a bit of a jargon-ridden slide, that one. So the projection is looking at somebody and not seeing them for who they really are, but actually chuck in our expectations and usually negative assumptions about that person onto the screen. We project all of that onto. We only see that which confirms our negative view of them. This is the confirmation bias. And we hang on to the things that really need to be said to that person. Actually, I'd like to say to them, mate, this is winding me up. I'd like to find some way that we can, marry our two working styles, because I can get impatient when we don't get to deadlines. What can we do about this? So that's what needs to be said. I don't say it, I just swallow it down. And it makes things worse. And like I say, people are turning their attention away from each other, and now they might tend to turn their attention towards management, HR, because it's now competitive and I want to win. I want to prove my point. I want to let you know that I'm in the right and you're in the wrong. And that's how we tend to act when we get to this point in a dispute, when we're getting pretty angry with the other person. Okay, let's get a mediator involved. So a mediator intervenes. Boom, there's a mediator at the top. So if HR have done everything they can, maybe they've tried to build the confidence in the parties to talk to each other directly, which is ideal. If you do that, we don't need mediators. Maybe there's a bit of need for support for the conversation between the two. Maybe there's a facilitated conversation done by HR or a manager or someone else. If that solves it, fantastic. You still don't need a mediator. If it goes beyond that, maybe it's a time to get an impartial third party involved, who can facilitate in an impartial way, with some good boundaries around the whole process, a better conversation between the two. What we could say is we're aiming to restore the dialogue, we're aiming to restore the psychological contact. So instead of them just projecting and imagining what the other person's thinking, imagining what their motives are, to set up an environment where it feels safe for both to talk about what their motives are, to talk about what their intentions are, to describe their mindset. Instead of having this retroflexion where people swallow down that which they actually need to express, let's set up a nice, safe environment where it's possible for them to say those difficult things, try and say the unsayable in a way. And if we can cut through all of that and help people to restore that contact, then we wouldn't have that confirmation bias, that cognitive dissonance. Maybe when we can see people clearly, we can accept their faults and they can accept ours, but we can also let in the good stuff and they can also see the good in us. So this is the retalk model. So what we do is there's a box drawn here around the two parties. So we set up the confidentiality. We do it away from a normal workplace. We have very strict rules about not retaining notes, about not allowing supporters, supporters. We don't allow recording, etc. So we're insulating the two parties very much from their factions and the environment around them, in order that we can achieve some objectives. The mediated objectives are to rebuild the dialogue so that the people say the unsayable. It's to restore that psychological contact, so they get a clearer view of each other, slightly changing their minds, only slightly changing their minds, but so that they can withdraw those projections and actually see that person for who they really are, rather than who they imagine the person to be, and to replace competition with collaboration. So we're trying to, instead of it being a win-lose thing about who's right and who's wrong, who's at fault, who's not at fault, the idea is the two parties, instead of banging their heads together, can actually put their heads together and figure out how to improve the relationship. How can we have a better future to this relationship that doesn't involve this clash, doesn't involve all the aggravation, doesn't involve us trying to win over each other? And those would be the objectives of getting the impartial third party involved, the mediator involved. Just a slight aside here, I was saying earlier about our 25 years of UK mediation, and thinking about things that come up again and again and again in the many, many thousands of disputes we've mediated, and the many tens of thousands of people we trained over these years, is one of the most popular myths and legends about mediation is that the mediator is there as an arbiter, that he or she is there to hear from both sides, get evidence and examples of what's gone wrong, or dates, times and places, hear from both sides, and then to make a judgment and to say, okay, I can see you know, that you shouldn't have done this and you might have done that, but, you know, perhaps you oughtn't to have said this or said that. Okay, what you need to do is, and the myth and legend, the very popular myth and legend about mediation is that the practitioner is an arbiter and he or she is going to make a judgment about who's right and wrong and is then going to give them a solution. They're going to give them their agreement, if you like, give them the action plan they need to follow in order to make the dispute go away. Very common, very frequently encountered misunderstanding about mediation. Not like that. The mediator is impartial. The mediator doesn't take a view. We're mostly, interested in the future of the dispute. People want to tell us about the history, but the particular focus of the mediator is looking at the future rather than the past. Okay. So that's where we are. Mediators getting involved. So what we do is we have separate meetings with the two parties, try and build rapport with each of the parties, try and encourage offloading. They are supported to future focus, like I say, but also to become a bit more self-aware about how they are in this dispute. It's one of the real values of having active listening from the mediator, empathic listening and responding from the mediator in private in a separate meeting initially. So the mediator will meet with A, meet with B, and have this good chance for the party to offload. And the mediator, in a sense, holds a mirror up to each of the parties so that they can, through the empathic listening and the active listening, start to think about, oh, okay, well, maybe there's a different world. Maybe there's a different way to conduct myself. Maybe what I need to know from this other party is this. Maybe what I want to say to the other party is that. Okay, so we start to just get this slight turning of the heads. Even though the wall is still there because we haven't brought them together yet, they are insulated from their factional supporters. They start to turn their attention to the possibility that this might work, that they could actually get something from this, and this process might lead to a better future of the relationship. They regain a little bit of curiosity about each other. I could say a lot about curiosity, but it sort of speaks for itself in terms of, yeah, I wonder why this happened. I wonder what would happen if I said this. I wonder what their motivation was in doing that. So they become prepared with the mediator's skill. They become prepared within this safe container, as we call it. Again, it's another idea from therapy, to risk having a direct exchange with the other party. That's what we do. We bring them together for a direct exchange. It might be face to face in the same room. It might be over a Zoom where they have a joint meeting. If they're not prepared to do that, we can potentially have a shuttle where we don't actually bring them eye to eye. We just keep them separate. But where we get to in this joint meeting, there's a lot to say about how the process of mediation works. There are other webinars on in our library that you can have a look at if you want to see exactly how the process works. But they start to build a shared narrative of what's gone on, or at least to try and integrate their differing narratives. They don't have to agree about what's happened up to this point, but what we like them to do is to start to agree about what's going to happen differently starting now. But when we get them within this safe container, insulated from their factional supporters, with the rapport having built between them individually and the mediator, then they can start to rebuild a bit of dialogue. Not always pretty, it doesn't always happen straight away. It's a slow and very step-by-step process. But what people can then start to do is express their own needs, but also be receptive to each other. So they undo the reflections and say what needs to be said, but they also start to hear from the other person so that the projections dissolve and they can start to see one another more clearly and to say what really needs to be said. They can say the unsayable, as I was saying. The dialogue begins to get restored. So as the dialogue begins to get restored, we see the mediator there at the top starting to withdraw a little bit. So they don't leave the room as such, but where we aim to get to in the mediation is a point where the dialogue is between the two parties and the mediator has less to do with the dialogue. So the mediator is the catalyst to the dialogue. He or she will say more at the start of the session, but as the session progresses and they start to have more of a conversation, mediator starts to move a little bit more into the shadows with a view on exiting the process and leaving them with an improved relationship. And they start to collaborate more. So we've got a very specific meaning to collaboration, but it's where instead of both parties trying to get their needs satisfied at the expense of the other person's needs, what they do is they start to see that there are two sets of needs in the room, and they start to put their heads together to figure out what can we do differently in terms of how we communicate and interact, our personal habits around the office, the management style around the office, the language we use with one another, etc., so that both of our sets of needs can be met simultaneously. And that's what we mean by collaboration. It's a hard task. It's a tricky thing to do, but with the mediator's support, that's where we need to get to. And while they're doing that, this is in a sense, this is the beginning of the end of the mediation. And the supporters, the factions, each side's army remain outside of the safe container for now. So we're still maintaining this confidentiality. We're not feeding back the detail of what got said and done in the mediation. We're not including any supporters or advocates in the process. We're keeping it just a safe container, just the mediator, with the mediator having his or her eye on the exit at this point. Now, if mediation ends successfully, mediator's gone, and we leave the two parties with their restored dialogue. So again, they're back to the point where they're able again to have that better dialogue, to integrate the different goals, priorities, and needs, or agree some new ways of doing things. Okay. Now, although the mediator's gone, there's still a little dip in the box there, so we can't ignore the fact that mediation has taken place. We can't ignore the fact that they have had this big conflict, this rupture in their working relationship. It has happened, and it will endure. The sort of memory of it will endure, but we can get back to a better dialogue, place a better dialogue between the two parties. The people around, those of you who do work as mediators, and there's quite a few on today, people we've trained and mediators who've trained elsewhere as well. What you see is that the supporters all around the outside, they can be a little bit aggrieved when the conflict gets resolved. It's like, oh, is it over then? And when the parties go back to the office after the mediation, the supporters are like, well, kind of, did you win? Did you sock it to him? Where they don't get to hear about the mediation. The colleagues and the supporters don't any longer have their own champion. It's not like, hey. And you'll also know in some workplaces, the conflict is more interesting than the work itself. So sometimes folks like to have a conflict to talk about and to chatter about and to, to tweet about. So the factionalism dissolves and people go, oh, okay, that's over then. And hopefully we'll support the parties to live this better relationship in this new atmosphere of better collaboration. They don't have their own champion. But what can happen then is they can start to re-engage more positively. Some people are very, very averse to conflict, very frightened by it, and I can understand absolutely why that is. And they will tend to hide in an environment where there's conflict in the office. When it's resolved, you tend to get heads up and people start to re-engage with those parties who've been in conflict. So not only, I've been emphasizing throughout about the importance of the context, what happens around the outside of the relationship between the two parties. And again, when it's resolved, that is significant as well. The whole team will change, the whole atmosphere will change in an office when we resolve the conflict between the two people who have fallen out. And it's a very, very significant thing for organizations when a team is dysfunctional because of the conflict or rupture in the relationship between two individuals. We can make a team more functional by making a dyad, two people's relationship, more functional. It affects everybody. However, sometimes mediation doesn't end successfully. There are figures about this. It's roundabout. Don't believe anybody who says they resolve 100% of disputes. They don't. So figures around this, if you look at research around the world in terms of success of mediation, it's around about 80 to 85%. If we take it to mean proper resolution to conflict, which is arrived at by the parties themselves and which endures beyond just a few weeks or days. Part of our service, just by the way, is that when we mediated disputes, we, as part of the contract, we follow up after 6 weeks and see whether the agreement has held up, or just whether it's been a non-stick agreement. And we don't really count the ones where it's been a non-stick agreement. Sometimes people agree something on the day insincerely, and then the whole thing falls apart in the days and weeks afterwards. We always encourage people to come back to mediation if that happens, but they don't always do so. However, round about 1 out of 5 times, maybe fewer than 1 out of 5 times, mediation is not successful the first time. Always worth a second go, but hey. In the event it's unsuccessful, the parties remain out of psychological contact. In the diagram, they're still turned away from each other. They haven't managed to break down the wall in between them. Their negative expectations of each other can actually get reinforced through the mediation if it goes badly. And they'll say, oh, it's typical of them. They said this and they said that, and they kept going on about this, kept going on about that. That's just typical. I knew that they were going to do that, and so they just reinforce their negative expectation of each other. A strong mediator would be able to work with that, but if it doesn't work for whatever reason, and I might also say at this point, with 25 years of experience behind us, one of the main reasons why mediation fails is that the situation is referred too late. We're always encouraging people to make early referrals. When it gets to that point where they're starting to mind read and have a very negative expectation of each other, where they're talking more to their own factional supporters, where it becomes tittle tattle and gossip around the office rather than those two people having any direct exchanges and interactions, get the process started there, whether it's a facilitated conversation or whether it's just helping the parties to feel more confident in themselves to have the conversation with the other individual. Do something at that point. Don't leave it, and particularly don't leave it until they're trying to initiate a formal process. It's often too late when you get to that point. And those delays are typically what leads to mediation failing. You've left it too long. Okay. But in the event the mediation doesn't work, things remain unsaid, so they're still retroflecting. They retain this lack of interest in the other. They don't have this curiosity or interest in the other. They think they know them. They know what to expect of them. I knew she was going to say that. I knew he was going to do that. That's typical. I bet he's thinking this. I bet she's thinking that. Okay, so we maintain this projection and this retroflection, and the relationship is very, very poor and remains so. And that's in the event that mediation fails. And as we can see on the diagram there, the factional supporters get involved again. So the parties come back from an unsuccessful mediation, and there's their team going, yeah, and whipping it up, and themselves sharing the party's view that, yeah, that's typical. I didn't think they were going to give any ground, and I don't know. Okay. So that's the sort of the bad news in today is when it doesn't work. Like I say, less than 20% of cases, far less than 20% of the cases where it doesn't work. Okay, so what I've illustrated is our model. I've illustrated the retalk model, which is a step-by-step process. It resembles other models, but what we have paid particular attention to is the psychology of the process. We're interested in what's going on under the bonnet. The idea is if you understand the people are in conflict, then you will have a good chance of resolving their conflict. So the idea with the retalk is that it restores a dialogue. It repairs people's relationships. And like I said, because of the contextual factor of, just that one-to-one relationship affecting a whole group of people, it can also rebuild teams. And we do work with teams a lot, particularly in certain organizations, and the same model can be applied in a similar way in order to actually address team conflict as well. Why is it important? Well, we can start to explain what we do. When I came, just go back to my own history, when I came into this field from psychotherapy, I was quite surprised at the lack of theory. In counselling and psychotherapy, there's a lot of theory. We always have a model, we have a framework, we have a means to try and understand what's going on before we even begin to practice. But I found in the mediation field there's a real lack of theory. So for me, this kind of a model starts to explain why we do what we do, and to know where conflict comes from helps us to resolve it. It sounds simplistic, but I think what I do see, and when I first came into this field, what I did see is people going, very well-intentioned people going rather mechanistically through a series of steps and stages without really understanding why. So I think being able to get under the bonnet and know where the conflict comes from helps us to resolve it, as does acknowledging the impact of context, acknowledging the impact of the external actors, acknowledging how much a dispute can be affected by the people who are not directly involved in it, but who are around the outside, who chip in, who get involved, who tweet, who, put stuff in WhatsApp groups to whip the conflict up. So, there's a significant impact there. And I think this kind of model acknowledges that, but also raises the very important question of what the mediator adds to a conflict resolution process. So we sometimes hear people say, well, why can't they sort it out for themselves? That's why. There's a bit of an answer there. So what would a mediator add? Why should we pay a very reasonable sum for a mediator to come in and offer their services, of conflict resolution here? Well, that's why. This is what they do. This is what the mediator adds to set up that environment, to set up that safe container, and to do all the things that a mediator does in order to restore and rebuild that dialogue. And the very last thing there is about when mediation fails. I think this kind of a model gives you a bit of insight into why it might have failed. Okay, so it tells us and helps us to understand why mediation does often work and just occasionally doesn't work. We can get a much better handle on that, which can help to improve practice, of course, and help us to be more reflective about our practice, understanding why it mostly does and sometimes doesn't work. Okay, so what we find then, just briefly here, what kind of approach is this? Well, we talked about a transformative and a facilitative approach. Is closer to transformative. It's mostly about the relationship. It's less about problem solving. Facilitative tends to be about problem solving. But what we're looking at here is somewhere in between transformative and facilitative. Can it be used online? Yes, it can. Of course it can. We call it Reconnect. We've been doing a lot more online mediation since pandemic. Who hasn't? So yes, indeed, we can use the same model online. It's absolutely the same thing. There are issues with online mediation. There's another webinar in the library about online. You could take a look at that where we talk about the pros and cons. But yes, the same model can exactly be applied to online mediation. Other questions we tend to get around the relational model, around retalk, kind of conflict, can it resolve pretty well anything? Complaints, medical mediation in particular, which is a particular interest of mine. But the workplace, family relationships, neighbourhood and commercial disputes. Commercial disputes where it's about a failure in the interaction, a failure in the relationship between the two parties. If it's purely about settlement conferencing, that's not for us. That's not something that we do. So we have divorced ourselves from the idea. People call it civil mediation. We don't really do the civil mediation that legal practitioners practice. Very best to look to them if it's what people want. The civil mediation idea, which is essentially evaluative settlement conferencing. That's a separate discipline. It's not really what we do, and neither do we do divorce and separation, which is a sort of a branch of family law, really. It's a quasi-legal process, which is not something that we're into. So types of conflict, anything with an interpersonal element, really. And can I see a case in action? Yes, you can. There's a workplace mediation online showcase, and there's an online one showcase as well. And we'll pop a link in the chat box so you can take a look at those if you wish. There's also a very large archive library of other webinars that you can take a look at to illustrate other aspects of what we do. But if you want to see how a process works, they're two really good webinars to have a look at. And now, if you have any questions other than the FAQs, rather presumptuous of me to tell you what you might have wanted to ask. So those are some of the things that people frequently ask. But if there are any of your own questions, we've got one here from Giles. Hiya, Giles. What advice, tools, or steps would you recommend a workplace implements to avoid the escalation of conflict? Keep people talking. Have opportunity. I think one thing is have your radar tuned into the beginning of conflict. Where do people start to speak negatively about each other? Where do people start to avoid each other or start to have very negative expectations about one another's motives and needs, Giles? But also train people up in terms of being able to facilitate resolution meetings. So when things do go wrong, when clashes of personality do take place, make sure there's somebody around who can get folks together and make sure that they have a good conversation. Some people have this natural ability to do that, and it's wonderful to see. but you might think about upskilling managers, team leaders, HR professionals in how to facilitate resolution meetings between people when it does start. The word mediation, Giles, can scare people. It sounds like an HR process, and it sounds like something quite formal, and it's going to go on with supervision notes, and I can't trust the confidentiality, and all the things we hear all the time about mediation. But if we can downscale that a little bit, just into having a skilled manager or team leader or HR professional who can facilitate a chat, a resolution chat between two people, just with the door closed, away from prying eyes, get them to have a chat and sort it out for themselves. That would be, if you had to do one thing, that would be it, Giles. Okay. And there we are. If you want to ask a question, just in the last couple of minutes now, I'll try and finish around about 12:50. Down at the bottom there, you'll have a react button down the bottom. If you press the up arrow there, it lets you put your hand up, and I'll be looking out for any hands up. And did you say there's a showcase video? It says Paul of Mediation and Action. Yeah, sure is. If you look up on the chat box there, Paul, it's up there. Scott popped it in there. So yes, there's a link going in the chat box. And in the next one is Eric from the Netherlands. Hi, Eric. As parties are separated from their context during the process, I wonder what your experience with the durability of the solutions and the shared narrative are when exposed to and questioned by the outside parties. What a fantastic question. And I think it can be part of the mediator's repertoire to actually say to people, okay, now you've resolved this, you've got to go back into the office. Can you agree what you're going to say to others about what's happened here today? And can you agree something, you two people who are currently still in mediation? Can you agree how you're going, what narrative are you two going to have when you get back out there and people ask you about how come you've managed to resolve this? I think it's a great question. And we do need to think about that transition back out from the safe container, Eric, back into the environment in which the conflict took place in the first instance, and say to people, what's your plan when you get back in the office in terms of talking about this and talking about how you've managed to resolve things. Brilliant. Another one from Matt says, would you do anything with the factional supporters or set any recommendations for the line manager? I never thought of this before. Something here about how the team may want to maintain the status quo. Very interesting. Ideally, you would get the party who have resolved their dispute to go back and to speak to the rest of the team about what's happened, and to speak to the rest of the team about how they feel this could be avoided in the future. I think learning lessons from mediation is important. It's always a little bit tricky because of the confidentiality of the process. But if the two parties within the safe container can agree what they're going to disclose, then when they get back there, how they're going to speak to the others. But the last bit of your question is very interesting, Matt. Something here about how the team may want to maintain the status quo. The team might want to keep the conflict going. The team might want to, they're used to that. Better the devil you know. They might be used to that friction being in the room, might be used to A and B always being at loggerheads. So it's a bit weird when they come back and they're chatting and they're okay and they agree to patch things up between them. That might be disruptive for the rest of the team. So dialogue is the answer, Matt. Have the two people speak to everybody about what they feel needs to happen now, and also what needs to happen in order to avoid this happening in the future. It doesn't suit everybody. I think that's the premise of your question, Matt, is that some people might want to maintain that conflict because it's what they're used to, it's what they know about. Okay. So Scott's popped the link for the workplace mediation online showcase there. It's the one at 12:48 in the chat box. Showcase there. Quite a few links there. They link through to our webinars. Very welcome to go and have a look at the library of webinars there. And we'll take one more from Clara, which is, I think, the last one where I'm going over time. I've been always told not to go over time. Could it be the case that parties do not wish to resolve the dispute purely because they don't wish to deal or face their factions afterwards? That's a great question. Yeah, you can lose face, can't you? So you've had this probably weeks or months of being this, adversary, and of being championed by your faction. And then you go in and sort it out, and then you got to go back and go, okay, I've resolved it, sorted. It happens in union negotiations quite a lot, and political negotiations, particularly around peace negotiations. you've got to go back and say, actually, I've made this concession and I've made that concession and I've agreed that I was wrong about this and I agreed I was wrong about that.
Exactly that, that I could be wrong,
So
or I may have been wrong.
that's it. It's a real tricky one. It's a real tricky one. So, so yeah, how are you going to face your factions afterwards? And I think it needs quite a lot of mettle, quite a lot of courage to be able to go back and do that for sure. Okay, right. I'm going to get told off for going over, so I'm going to stop. So this has been our webinar today. All about psychology of conflict, all about our model retalk, about how conflict develops, what we can do as impartial third parties to resolve it. Thanks for your great questions, fantastic. If you want to have further discussions, you know where to find us. Okay, social media, check out the website, stay in touch. Fantastic to have so many of you joining us, and many, many thanks for your comments and questions. Have a great weekend. We'll see you next time.